All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to alert you to exciting new theories and discoveries that are way off the beaten path that you probably never heard of, but if you had, it would affect your life in profound ways. And today is our, I believe, 192nd, 93rd Bible Decode, and all of them coming from the New Testament. We will be getting to the Old Testament eventually, and it's going to be explosive. But the New Testament stuff is as well, in particular looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and getting some decode information from that, and also looking into the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. That includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. The theory goes, according to several authors now, and many authors in the past centuries as well, that the Romans of the Flavian dynasty wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 plus years. And then they also wrote a history of a war between the Romans and the Jews called Jewish War, or War of the Jews. That's from 66 until 73 AD. And Vespasian and Titus were really the protagonists of the story, or, you know, they were the Roman generals that were fighting in this war against the Jews, and they were both wounded in the war, and then eventually they both became emperor. And they wrote this story under the name of Josephus. Not sure if Josephus was a real person or a pseudonym or a group of people. According to Josephus' autobiography, he was a Jewish general who surrendered to Vespasian, and at that time saw that the Romans, God now favors the Romans and not the Jews, and so he defected to the Romans. Then he gave Vespasian the star prophecy saying that you will one day become emperor. When Vespasian did become emperor in 69 AD, he pardoned Josephus and had him start working for him. Brought him to Rome eventually as one of the court historians, set him up in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. And so he became known as Flavius Josephus. And if you read Flavius Josephus's War of the Jews, you'll be struck. If you know what you're looking for, if you are looking for something, you will be struck by the amount of parallels between the Gospels and War of the Jews. And in particular, you will see that Jesus' 3-year ministry in Judea is a replica of Titus's 3-year military campaign in Judea. They both go to various locations, and every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. And they go to these places in the same order, and they encounter at each location a parallel events, typologically similar, though not identical events. And these events are spaced out by 40 years. And this is well over 40 events, not just a couple. And that was discovered by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, which came out 2005. And actual Flavian signature version from 2010. In 2024, Michael Menescatz wrote another book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And he dug into the book of Luke looking for parallels with Josephus's War of the Jews and found over 250 just in the book of Luke. And he not only discovered these various parallels and talks about each one of them in turn in his book, but he graphed them on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every place he found a correspondence, he put a dot. And after plotting 250 plus dots, he had made 5 near perfect letters of the same size in Latin, APTVS. The T and the V, I would believe, would stand for Titus and Vespasian, maybe the S too. And the AP, maybe Arius Piso, maybe Aegian Pneuma, Pneuma with a silent P. Not sure, and either is Menescatz exactly. But the main point, because a lot of times Christian apologists tend to focus on areas where you're unsure of yourself and just, tear you down on that level, where the actual area that you're unsure of yourself is not germane to your main point. And the main point is that not only did the Romans write the Gospels, but they literally signed their names to them so that you would eventually discover these things. But they probably didn't think it was going to take almost 2,000 years and counting for us to discover them. The amount of circumstantial evidence is also substantial. The motive was there for the Romans. They needed to mellow out the Jews. The Jews had been a major pain in the Roman Empire's side for over 125 years. And it was one uprising after a revolt, after an insurrection, and then culminating with this war. The Romans knew that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, that a Jewish Messiah who was going to rise up and help them overthrow the Romans. And 3 pretenders to that Messiahship rose up in 66 AD, and the Jews did kick out the Herod puppet client government of Rome. King Agrippa II fled back to Rome, and Emperor Nero in turn sent in General Vespasian to quell the revolt. And so, once Vespasian got done with the war, and Titus as well, they went into the normal Roman bag of tricks. Psychological warfare, psychological operations. And they put together the story of a Jewish Messiah who, instead of being a military commander, was a prince of peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the very same time going outside the Jewish temple and overturning the tables of the money changers who were Jewish, who were trying to turn the Roman money, which had graven images all over it, to the kosher Jewish money, to purchase the small animals for the sacrifice inside the temple. And Jesus is also yelling at all of the Jews who were out there selling those small animals. So Jesus is taking a direct hit on the Jews and their rituals, and being completely deferential toward Rome, which is exactly what he would be if he had been written by the Romans. And Paul is even worse in that regard, even more pro-Roman than Jesus is. And this is also reflected. The Romans used language such as domesticate and tame and prune, and they even employed botany, and they talk. Titus is said to have been traveling around with this guy Pedanius, and he is like the world's first homeopathist. And they also talk about grafting, and that's what they were doing. They were grafting themselves onto the Jewish tradition. And this is shown with the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament. All of the prophecies that Jesus makes are fulfilled in the pages of War of the Jews, particularly his prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. That was fulfilled by Titus. Jesus says that the fulfillment of the destruction of Jerusalem will augur in my second coming, making Titus the second coming of Jesus. So in the long line of Jewish patriarchs, all the way from Adam to Seth to Noah to Abraham to Moses to David and Solomon, and then all the way to Jesus, then next is Titus. Titus superimposes himself on the Jewish tradition as the second coming of Jesus. Also, the Romans had a monopoly on publishing, censorship, and distribution. Nobody could have written these Gospels except for the Romans. They were written in Greek, which is the language of the Romans. Now, the Roman royals also spoke and wrote in Latin, just like the APTVS signature. Whereas in Judea, they were speaking and writing in Aramaic. If they wrote at all, which they only 3 to 5% did, and much rarer was seen the language of Greek. And obviously Greek is the language of the New Testament and also the language of Josephus. So now what we've been taking this Roman origins hypothesis and applying it in other places. So we looked at this book of Christian apologetics called Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and show that due to Mr. Strobel's either willful or innocent ignorance of the Roman origins hypothesis, he ends up attempting to make a case for Christ, but actually makes a better case for Caesar, because he and the people that he interviews, the scholars that he interviews, often make arguments in absentia that, oh, well, there is no other explanation, and so the resurrection must have been from God or some such thing. And not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis, which is a much, much better explanation than the supernatural explanation. It is rational, reasonable, and actually exactly what the Romans created a number of other religions in the first century as well. It's not taking any type of leaps, leaps of faith that is completely not only rational but like expected, and really even you could predict it. Oh, I bet the Romans would do this. If this had happened in the 20th century or the 21st century, all of the Christians in the truther movement would immediately recognize it as a psyop, and they would immediately recognize the conspiracy, And they would immediately recognize that the odds of such a thing, of all of the parallel events and the other parallels between Josephus and the Gospels are way, way beyond the realm of probability as far as a coincidence is concerned. Okay, now what we're looking at is the author's name is David Fitzgerald. His book called Nailed, and he is really like a Christian skeptic. He goes through kind of the 10 Christian myths that they think that Christians take for granted, but that if you look more deeply, you see that they are not on firm ground whatsoever. And I very much agree with that premise that Christians really are overconfident. They think they have a lot more evidence at their disposal than they do, because they don't have any evidence. All of the evidence for the Christian, the case for Christ, is Roman evidence. All of the people that corroborated the existence of Jesus are Roman royals, such as Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, and Emperor Trajan. These people all are closely related to the Roman royals. And so their word is not to be trusted when they refer to somebody, refer to Jesus, or refer to Christians. But this is what Christians hang their hats on. Now, on the other hand, I actually prefer the Christians over these atheists, which is really just scientism and maybe some socialism thrown in, because the Romans' psyop is a limited hangout. The Romans want you to be a good citizen. They want you to be a productive citizen, a hardworking citizen, and a law-abiding citizen. And Christians are that. Whereas the atheists, the level of fraud involved in science is much higher than it is in religion, believe it. I don't know that what kind of scale you would use, but I just know that the scientific field is so loaded with quacks, but also even fairly, what they think are honest scientists whose cognitive dissonance is so high that they refuse to believe like studies in and evidence of anomalies in their field, and they cling to these paradigms that are way disproven in the same way that religious people do. But at least the religious people are hardworking and industrious, whereas the scientists are more into like destruction, especially the communists. Okay, now let's go through, I think we're on chapter 9, so we're getting close to the end of the book here. Paul's Christians seem to have no details of Jesus' early life, and instead venerate a cosmic Christ who traveled to the Hebrew underworld and back up through the layers of the heavens to defeat the demonic spirits. Yes, so Paul doesn't really even see Jesus as a flesh and blood being. And he gives no credit to people who have seen him as a flesh and blood being, like his brother James and Peter and John. They get no credit from Paul for actually having seen him in the flesh and blood, assuming that all of this ever did take place, which it didn't. So, part of the Roman origins hypothesis, takes this out of its misery before it even starts. But this guy Fitzgerald goes through the motions of, getting it in the other way, Because a lot of times Christians will, they will, if they feel like they can defeat your theory, then that means that Christianity is back, you know, in its normal, comfortable place. You know, they can, if they can debunk your theory, then that means that they can, you know, be comfortable with their Christianity. But the truth of the matter is, even if you debunk the theory, the Christianity is still on a Jenga tower or whatever. It's just waiting to collapse, a house of cards. Okay, Mark's community took the opposite tack. Their suffering, Jesus was an ordinary human man whom God adopted at his baptism, tested and later resurrected and exalted to divine Lord to reward his obedience. And this is in stark contrast with the community who followed the Gospel of John. There Jesus was the Logos, who was there at creation and fearlessly wanders across Judea, loudly declaring that he is God himself. In the epistle to the Hebrews, Jesus is the heavenly high priest who offers his sacrifice in a heavenly sanctuary, a perfect blend of traditional Jewish theology and Alexandrian-style Platonism, and a conception of Christ unlike any other. So in addition to Peter's, Paul's, John the Baptist, and many other gospel factions, there were still many other Christian or proto-Christian sects in the 1st and 2nd century. Some we know nothing about, except that their names happen to be included in Orthodox heresy hunting manuals. If these men were really the first, at which some of the Roman origin hypothesis authors, such as Roman Piso and Abelard Reichlen, they believe that these Orthodox heresy hunting manuals written by a lot of the church fathers, that these were also written by the Romans. And the Romans also wrote the Apocrypha. I can kind of envision that the Romans kind of like had a contest. They put up the maybe like 20 different points that had to be hit, you know, and write a story about this guy, and, you know, he has these certain traits and these certain characteristics, and it's got to fit into this part of the story. And they got, you know, 50 different entries, and they took the top 4, and then they took the rest of them to Egypt and buried them in a cave, you know, and then they were discovered in 1945. I can definitely see that they could have written the Apocrypha. Okay, if these men were really the first missionaries and fathers of the church, talking about Peter and John and also Paul, surely they would have had writings that were treasured by the first Christians, even if they had dictated them to a scribe. Sermons, memoirs, letters, doctrinal teachings, liturgy, encouragements. The list of what we might expect from them goes on and on. Yet the truth is we have nothing from any of the 12 apostles. Not a single authentic document. Only a handful of forgeries like 1st and 2nd Peter from much later writings. Many Christian communities wrote a biography of the disciple they adopted as their founder. Now, this is, you know, he talks about this debate earlier in this book, but he believes that Matthew, who many Christians might have believed is an apostle, is not mainly on the source of the fact that 90% of the book of Matthew is a copy of the book of Mark, and that Mark is supposed to be kind of a conduit from Peter. And so Mark admits that he wasn't there. He's relating Peter's story. And so why would Matthew be copying Matthew who was there? Why would a Matthew who was there be copying from a Mark who was not there? And then that the John involved in writing the Gospels is not the same John of the Apostle John, because he was writing in a much, much later period, as late as 100 AD. Now, so there's there could be a lot of dispute there. It's much easier to just lop it all off with the Roman origins hypothesis and recognize that all of it is fiction. Mark appears to simply have co-opted the names of the known leaders of the early Jerusalem church, James, Peter, John, and Cephas. Now, he contends that Peter and Cephas are two different people, and recast them as Jesus' disciples or family. In the Gospels, Peter and Cephas are conflated, for example, in John 1:42. But venerable Christian tradition notwithstanding, Paul makes it clear they are two separate individuals in Galatians 2:7-9. That's interesting. I don't, again, he's splitting hairs. By criterion of embarrassment, Meyer means I'm not sure if he's an apologist or a skeptic, but that the crucifixion and Jesus' betrayal by Judas were too shocking for early believers to make up. They couldn't have made them up. The truth is stranger than fiction, apparently. So they can only be historical facts. This is the kind of loose, lazy thinking that a lot of apologists use. That betrayal, the crucifixion and Jesus' betrayal by Judas were too shocking for early believers to make up. So they can only be historical facts. He notes that right from the beginning, believers repeat that all these events occurred according to the scriptures. I'm not sure what that means. He says, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5, Matthew 27:9, Mark 14:21, John 13:18, John 17:12, and Acts 1:16 and 1:20. If you're interested in checking that out. Nothing that would indicate that the 12 Paul mentions are Jesus' disciples. These are the 12 that Paul mentions as the people who witnessed the resurrection. And he says that this 12 Paul mentions are Jesus' disciples or of the Gospels and Acts. Paul says much about his interactions with the leaders of the Jerusalem church and other apostles, but any mention of the 12 is glaringly absent. One would have expected that the history of the first Christian generation would be replete with examples of the 12's powerful presence and activity in the church. The exact opposite is the case. Luke, for all the emphasis he puts on the 12 as a living link between the time of Jesus and the time of the church, has increasingly little to say about the 12 as the chapters of Acts pass on. The total silence from the rest of the literature of the New Testament, all of the pseudo-Paul stuff, or they call Deutero-Paul, the 6 epistles that they've determined that Paul did not write, and James and Peter and John, Jude and Hebrews, is equally deafening. The same could be said for almost the entire corpus of the Apostolic Fathers, that they never talk about the 12. Well, that's kind of interesting because, well, now he's going to bring this up. Frank Zindler argues that the 12 clearly serve a zodiacal function in the Gospels. That's exactly what I was going to say, that, you know, a lot of people do recognize the astrological zodiacal function. And so are the 12 there or not? Same historians who do not accept astrological motifs in the Gospels have no difficulty recognizing that the sacred iconography of Christianity's sister religion, Mithraism, is an allegorical depiction of astronomical phenomenon. So I think both of them are doing it. Like, he, as an atheist, is doing it in one direction, saying, oh, nobody's referring to the 12, but then he's talking about the astrological function. But he's accusing the Christian apologists as not accepting the astrological function, but at the same time recognizing it in Mithraism as an allegorical depiction of astronomical phenomena. So if it's a pagan belief or any belief outside of Christianity, then you can dismiss it as astronomical. The same thing they do with the Old Testament, where it's obvious that the book of Genesis, at least up until Genesis 11 or so, is a copy or plagiarized from the Sumerian and all of the related Babylonian ancient texts that are much, much older than the Bible, much, much older than the New Testament, and they're telling the same stories: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark, you know, but they, even though those are the original sources of the Old Testament, they call them mythological, while at the same time they call the Hebrew scriptures as historical. So that's really that's rich there, rich into what we would call cognitive dissonance. An allegorical depiction of astronomical phenomena, namely the precession of the equinoxes, which if you read Giorgio de Santillana's, along with Herta von Dechen, their book Hamlet's Mill, shows how all ancient people all over the world understood this phenomenon of precession and wove it into their